There was a moment in Britain when a 17-year-old lad could walk into a Ford dealership, point at an Escort Mexico, and drive it home on an apprentice's wages. Saturday afternoons meant lying under a cortina on the driveway with your dad. Friday nights meant a run up the bypass with your mates. The car was not transport. It was identity, freedom, and the whole shape of your social life wrapped in metal and engine noise. That world is gone. And most people have no idea what actually killed it. Because here is the thing that nobody tells you. British car culture did not die because people stopped caring about cars. It died because the exact conditions that created it were so specific, so deeply tied to one moment in British economic history that they could only ever belong to one generation. The baby boomers were not just the people who loved British car culture. They were the entire ecosystem that made it possible, and when their era ended, the culture went with them. To understand why, you have to go back to the years just after the war. Britain in the late 1940s and through the 1950s was a country being rebuilt from the rubble. The factories that had spent years producing tanks and bombers were being retooled to make cars, refrigerators, and the material fabric of a new kind of ordinary life. The baby boom was underway. Between 1946 and 1964, the UK birth rate produced a generation that would become the largest, most economically significant cohort in British history. They were born into a country that was quite literally being rebuilt around the automobile. The ML motorway opened in 1959. Bypass roads and ring roads were slicing through the landscape of every major British city. Suburbs were expanding outward from Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and London in the same direction as the car. You needed a vehicle to get to the new out-of-town shops, the new housing estates, the new way of living that post-war Britain was building for itself. But here is where it gets personal. These kids were not just passengers, they were obsessed. Saturday afternoons in Britain in the 1960s had a specific texture. Driveways full of young men with their heads under bonnets, garages with racing decals on the walls, car magazines that were not niche publications but cultural scripture passed around factories and sixth form common rooms. Motoring news. Autocar, car, motor, these were not specialist publications for enthusiasts. They were mass market reading for an entire generation of young people for whom the car was the central object of aspiration. The Ford Capri, launched in 1969, was sold with the slogan, "The car you always promised yourself." Not the car you need. Not the car that makes sense. The car you always promised yourself. Ford understood exactly what they were selling and to whom they were selling it. And the prices made the promise keep able. Here is the number that everything else in this video hangs on. Site Index Cluck 76.1. The Ford Cortina, launched in 1962, started at 573 I site. The average annual male wage in Britain in 1962 was approximately $800. A brand new family Ford cost roughly 8.5 months of average earnings. The Ford Escort Mexico, the performance car that a generation of working-class British lads genuinely lusted after, I cite Index Cluck 61 wine cost just under $1,200 in 1971. I cite. Average wages that year were approximately $1,300. A car that defined a generation cost roughly 11 months of average income. Now compare that to today. Site Index Set 80. 1. The average new car price in the UK in 2026 is approximately $34,000. The average new car represented around 33 weeks of gross pay for a typical UK worker in 2016. Today, it equates to approximately 47 weeks' salary before tax. Site, and that is just the purchase price. Site Index Core 81 insurance premiums have risen from an average of $400 per year in 2016 to $695 in 2026. Fuel prices have increased from around 104 pence per litre to between 147 and 155 pence. Servicing costs have risen by more than 66% in 10 years. Unsight. The basic Ford equivalent today, a Volkswagen Golf Life, starts at approximately $28,895. A car that plays the same cultural role in 2026 that the Cortina played in 1972 costs 36 times more in nominal terms, against wages that have risen far less. The emotional accessibility that made British car culture what it was has been mathematically destroyed. But here is the part of the story that the nostalgic content almost always skips, because the prices were only half of it. The other half was space, physical space, cultural space. Time, the British baby boomer grew up in a country where young working people had access to something that their equivalents today simply do not have in anything like the same way. They had houses with garages or at minimum driveways and garden sheds. They owned their homes younger, or they lived in stable social housing that came with physical space. They had long summer evenings that did not need to be monetized to justify their existence. They had a manufacturing base that kept spare parts cheap and available. They had fathers and uncles who worked in the motor trade, in engineering, in factories, who had the knowledge to pass on and who had the time and inclination to pass it on in exactly this way. Lying under a car on a Saturday afternoon with someone who knew what they were doing was not a romantic image. It was the ordinary reality of how a generation learned to engage with machines. That infrastructure of space, time, knowledge, and community produced something that cannot be manufactured by policy or replicated by a YouTube tutorial. It produced a genuine mechanical culture that was not a hobby for the wealthy, but a practical skill of the working and lower middle class. The car was the thing around which this culture organized itself, because the car was the most technically complex and most personally meaningful object in the ordinary British life of the 1960s and 1970s. And then several things happened almost simultaneously. The first was the oil crisis of 1973. Petrol queues stretching around blocks in every British town. The government implementing the 3-day working week. A sudden and visceral reminder that the age of cheap energy had conditions attached to it. The golden age of the big, powerful, affordable British performance car was already beginning to buckle under the weight of new insurance regulations, new emissions requirements, and the rising cost of everything that made those cars work. The cars themselves became more expensive to run, more expensive to insure, and in some cases more expensive to maintain as the industry moved away from the simple mechanical layouts that any reasonably skilled amateur could work on in their driveway. The second thing was the collapse of the British car industry. Between 1970 and 1990, British Leyland, which had represented everything from Morris to Triumph to Austin to Rover, went from being a major global manufacturer to a cautionary tale of industrial mismanagement, labor unrest, and governmental incompetence. The cars it produced in its declining years, the Allegro, the Princess, the Maestro, were not the objects of desire that a car culture requires to sustain itself. They were objects of resignation. The emotional charge that the Escort Mexico or the Capri had generated was simply absent from the products that replaced them. The culture lost its object. But the baby boomers carried it forward anyway. They bought the classics. They funded the restoration industry. They filled the Goodwood Revival and the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu. They kept the specialist magazines alive long after the mass-market interest had moved elsewhere. They maintained the entire infrastructure of British automotive nostalgia on the sheer force of their numbers, their wealth, their emotional investment, and their disposable income. They were essentially an entire culture running on memory and money. For several decades, that worked. It kept car culture alive in Britain in a form that looked, from the outside, like it might be sustainable. It was not sustainable. It was a generation keeping itself warm. Now look at what the generation that follows inherited. A 22-year-old in Britain today who might have in another era bought a performance car on a working wage and spent their weekends learning about engines faces a completely different set of material realities. Site Index Sluskirk 82.1 new car prices have risen 25% since 2020, according to official CPI figures, with some industry estimates putting the real increase at 30 to 40% once you account for specification changes and model repositioning. Sales/site. The average new car now costs approximately 47 weeks of gross salary. But the salary itself is largely consumed before it reaches anything as discretionary as a car purchase. Rent or mortgage, student loans, which did not exist in anything like today's form for the baby boomer generation. Childcare, utilities, the basic structural costs of a British life in 2026 consume a share of disposable income that leaves almost nothing for the kind of discretionary spending that car culture requires. Then, there is the space problem. Most young British people today do not live in houses with driveways or garages. They live in flats, in shared houses, in rented accommodation where the landlord's tolerance for a project car leaking oil on the driveway is precisely zero. Where do you work on a car if you have no driveway? Where do you store the tools? Where do you do the thing that requires physical access to the machine over a long period of time? You cannot learn to rebuild an engine in a car park. You cannot do the patient, grubby, time-consuming work that genuine mechanical engagement requires if you have no permanent physical space to do it in. The property market did not just make buying a home unaffordable. It made the entire practical and spatial infrastructure of car culture inaccessible to an entire generation. And then there is the psychological dimension. The baby boomer car culture was built around a very specific form of status and identity. The car you drove told people who you were, what you earned, what you valued, and how serious you were about being taken seriously. A young man arriving at a Saturday night gathering in a well-maintained Escort RS was making a statement about himself that the whole community understood and respected. That particular transaction of status, where the car was the object through which identity was publicly performed, has been comprehensively disrupted by the phone. A 22-year-old today can build an audience, demonstrate taste, show affiliations, display humor, and establish identity in front of tens of thousands of people through a screen in their pocket. The car did a specific psychological job for the baby boomer generation. That job has not disappeared. It has migrated, and the car is no longer the primary vehicle for it, if you will forgive the expression. There is also the environmental dimension, and this one requires honesty rather than sentiment. The baby boomer generation grew up before climate change was a cultural conversation. The internal combustion engine felt consequence-free because nobody was measuring consequences yet. Today's young people have grown up being told from childhood, from school, from every direction of public discourse, that the petrol engine is a threat to the future of the planet. You can disagree with how that message has been communicated. You can question the policy responses to it. But you cannot deny that it has added a layer of cultural friction to the simple act of loving a loud engine that simply did not exist for the generation that preceded them. The relationship between young people and the combustion engine in 2026 is complicated in a way it was not in 1972. That complication matters. Now look at the car shows. The Goodwood Festival of Speed, the classic car auction rooms, the specialist magazines that remain. Count the heads, note the gray hair. The British car culture that the baby boomers built and sustained and kept alive is now almost entirely populated by the people who created it. The people who come to these events to feel something they felt at 17 are the people who felt it at 17. The transfer of that passion to the next generation has not happened at anything like the scale required to sustain the culture in the form it currently takes. Some will say that car culture is simply evolving. The modified scene, the track day community, the electric performance car crowd, the overlanders and the off-roaders. And there is genuine passion in all of those spaces. Passion does not simply die, it relocates. But here is the critical distinction. None of these subcultures have the scale, the mainstream penetration, or the economic weight that British baby boomer car culture had at its peak. A community of track day enthusiasts is not the same thing as an entire country pointing its cultural identity at the automobile. One is a community, the other was a worldview. The difference is not trivial, it is the difference between a niche interest and a generational identity. The baby boomers were not just the audience for British car culture. They were every layer of it simultaneously. The mechanics, the collectors, the magazine readers, the show attendees, the restoration market, the parts trade, the racing spectators, the motoring correspondents, the purchasing power. They were the entire ecosystem at once. An ecosystem that large and that unified cannot survive the exit of the generation that constituted it. What follows is not decline. It is a different world entirely. And perhaps the most honest question is not why car culture died in Britain, but whether we were ever honest about what it actually was. It was never purely about the cars. It was about a specific form of freedom that was economically accessible to a specific generation at a specific moment in British history. It was about the combination of cheap machines, available space, transferable knowledge, and disposable time that history provided to exactly one generation of British people and then quietly withdrew as the economy transformed around them. The Ford Cortina that cost 11 months of an apprentice's wages in 1962 was not just a car, it was permission. Permission to move, to aspire, to be someone, to own something real and mechanical, and yours, at an age and on an income that made that possible. That permission has been revoked by forces that nobody planned and nobody voted for. The housing market, the service economy, the collapse of manufacturing, the cost of everything. And a generation is growing up in Britain without it, not because they do not want it, but because the door has been closed and nobody left them a key. If this gave you something to think about, please hit the like button and subscribe to UK Finance with Peter for more straight-talking content on money, the economy, and what they mean for the people living through them. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.